The room was cold, sterile, filled with gleaming stainless steel and the mechanical hum of expensive appliances, yet the warmth was nowhere to be found. The sound of her knife against the cutting board echoed like a metronome through the silence. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're preparing dinner for someone who won't even thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is. But I promise, today's story will touch your heart in ways you never expected. This is the story of Sophia Delacroix, a woman whose hands knew the secret language of flour and fire, whose heart beat in rhythm with simmering sauces and rising bread. For 7 years, she had been the invisible soul of a towering Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park, where crystal chandeliers cast cold light on marble countertops, and where her employer, Harrison Blackwood, built his financial empire on cryptocurrency investments and real estate holdings worth millions of dollars. Sophia arrived at the penthouse kitchen every morning at 4:30, when the city still slept beneath a blanket of pre-dawn darkness. Her weathered hands, marked by years of burns and cuts, moved with the precision of a surgeon as she prepared the day's meals. Born in New Orleans to a Creole grandmother who taught her that food was love made visible, Sophia carried within her the memory of Sunday gumbos, of cornbread that crumbled like golden sand, of jambalaya that told stories of 3 cultures dancing together in one pot. The penthouse kitchen was a monument to wealth. Sub-zero refrigerators hummed quietly beside Italian marble islands, professional-grade ovens gleamed like silver altars, and knife sets worth more than Sophia's monthly salary hung in perfect formation. Yet despite all this luxury, the space felt hollow, like a museum where no one ever lingered to savor the art. Harrison Blackwood was a man who spoke in numbers, stock portfolios, Bitcoin fluctuations, quarterly reports that determined the fate of thousands. His fortune, built on shrewd investments in emerging technologies and Manhattan properties, insulated him from the world most people inhabited. He ate Sophia's meals with the same mechanical precision with which he reviewed financial statements, barely lifting his eyes from his phone screen, where green and red numbers danced like digital rain. Sophia would watch him sometimes, this man whose net worth could feed entire neighborhoods, as he consumed her carefully crafted dishes without a single word of recognition. She had learned to read the subtle language of his preferences. He favored her blackened fish over anything the previous chef had attempted, though he never said so. His shoulders would relax slightly when the aroma of her grandmother's cornbread filled the dining room, though his face remained mask-like, impenetrable. The other residents of his world treated Sophia like expensive furniture, necessary but forgettable. Harrison's business partner, Victoria Sterling, would sweep through the kitchen in her Louboutin heels, her conversations peppered with talk of insider trading and offshore accounts, never acknowledging Sophia's presence except to bark orders for specific wines or dietary restrictions for their evening clients. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, was kind but distant, speaking only when necessary, both women understanding their place in this hierarchy of silence. Yet, Sophia found moments of quiet joy in her work. She would hum old spirituals while kneading dough, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. Baby girl, you put your soul in that bread, and it's gonna feed more than just the body. Her hands moved like prayer over ingredients, transforming simple flour and water into something that held the power to comfort, to heal, to remind people they were human. The kitchen came alive under Sophia's touch in ways that expensive equipment never could. She coaxed flavors from humble ingredients that the previous chef, despite his culinary school credentials and impressive resume, had never managed to achieve. Her roux was dark as Mississippi mud and twice as rich. Her seasoning sang harmonies that made even Harrison's stone-faced security detail pause and inhale deeply when they passed through. But recognition remained elusive, invisible as the woman who created these daily miracles. Harrison's world was built on transactions, on measurable returns on investment, on assets that could be calculated and leveraged. Sophia's contribution couldn't be quantized in his ledgers, couldn't be converted to cryptocurrency or added to his diversified portfolio. She existed in the margins of his consciousness, essential but unacknowledged, like the air he breathed without thinking. The loneliness of her position settled into Sophia's bones like winter cold. She had left behind family in New Orleans, drawn to New York by the promise of higher wages and the chance to cook for someone who could presumably appreciate quality. Instead, she found herself in a golden cage, surrounded by luxury, but starved for simple human acknowledgement. Her small studio apartment in Queens felt more like home than this marble palace ever would, filled with photographs of her grandmother and the lingering scent of the pralines she made on lonely Sunday afternoons. Still, Sophia persisted, because cooking was not just her profession. It was her prayer, her offering to a world that often seemed determined to diminish her. Every meal she prepared carried within it the accumulated wisdom of generations, the love of women who had stirred pots and tended fires long before her, who had understood that feeding someone was the most fundamental act of care one human could offer another. The seasons changed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, but inside, time moved in the rhythm of Sophia's routines. She watched Harrison's fortune grow through overheard phone conversations about successful Bitcoin investments and booming real estate acquisitions, yet she knew that all his millions couldn't purchase what her grandmother had given her freely. The knowledge that true wealth lay not in accumulation, but in the generous sharing of oneself with others. Each evening, as Sophia cleaned the last dish and prepared to return to her small apartment, she would pause at the kitchen window and look out over the glittering city below. Somewhere in those countless lights were families gathered around modest tables, sharing simple meals prepared with love rather than obligation. She carried that image with her as she rode the subway home, a reminder that her gifts, though unacknowledged in this marble tower, still held the power to nourish souls, even if only one soul at a time. Harrison Blackwood's life was a carefully orchestrated symphony of profit margins and market fluctuations, but Sophia's presence had begun to introduce subtle harmonies he was only beginning to recognize. Though he would never admit it, even to himself, the rhythm of his days had begun to revolve around the quiet anticipation of her meals, the way certain aromas could slow his relentless pace and make him remember, just for a moment, that he was more than just a collection of assets and investments. The foundation was being laid for a transformation neither of them could predict, built one meal at a time, one unacknowledged act of care after another, until the day would come when the silence between them would finally break, and the true value of Sophia's gifts would be impossible to ignore. Sophia's 7th year in the Blackwood penthouse began with the subtle shift that comes before all great changes, though neither she nor Harrison recognized the signs. The financial markets Harrison monitored so obsessively showed record gains. His cryptocurrency portfolio had tripled, his real estate investments were generating unprecedented returns, and his wealth management firm was attracting clients with investment capitals measuring in the hundreds of millions. Yet despite this paper prosperity, something essential was missing from his life. A hunger that no amount of money in his bank accounts could satisfy. It was during this time that Sophia first noticed the small changes in Harrison's behavior. He began arriving in the kitchen earlier in the mornings, ostensibly to review financial reports while drinking his coffee. But she caught him watching her hands as she worked, his eyes following the practiced movements of her knife as she diced onions with mathematical precision. He would linger at the breakfast bar, his laptop open to cryptocurrency charts and stock analyses, but his attention seemed drawn to the sound Sophia created, the rhythmic chopping, the gentle bubble of simmering stocks, the whispered sizzle of garlic hitting hot oil. "The markets opened strong in Tokyo," he would say to no one in particular, his voice cutting through the morning quiet. Sophia would nod politely, though they both knew he wasn't really talking about markets. He was filling the silence because something about her presence made the emptiness of his penthouse feel less absolute, though he lacked the vocabulary to name what he was experiencing. Sophia began to notice other things too. Harrison ate more slowly now, sometimes putting down his phone entirely during meals. She observed the way his shoulders would unknot slightly when she served her grandmother's cornbread, how his breathing would deepen when the scent of her seafood gumbo filled the dining room. These were small victories in a war against indifference she had been fighting for 7 years, yet she was careful not to read too much into them. Men like Harrison Blackwood, with their offshore accounts and diversified portfolios, didn't suddenly develop emotional connections to their domestic staff. The breakthrough came on a particularly brutal February morning when a massive blizzard crippled the city's transportation systems. Sophia had awakened at 3 a.m. to discover that the subway lines were suspended, the buses weren't running, and the streets were buried under 18 inches of snow. Any reasonable person would have called in, would have stayed home where it was warm and safe. But Sophia was not reasonable when it came to her responsibilities. She walked. For 2.5 hours, through empty streets where her footprints were the only signs of human passage, past shuttered stores and abandoned vehicles, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. "Baby girl, when folks depend on you, you show up. Snow, rain, or shine, you show up." By the time she reached the penthouse, her clothes were soaked through, her lips blue with cold, and her hands so numb she could barely turn the key in the service entrance. Harrison found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later, still shivering as she prepared his morning coffee, with hands that trembled from more than just cold. For the first time in 7 years, he truly saw her, not as a function or a service provider, but as a human being who had sacrificed her own comfort and safety to ensure he would not go without his breakfast. "Sophia," he said, her name sounding strange and uncertain in his mouth. It was perhaps the 3rd time he had ever addressed her directly. "You walked here, in this storm?" She looked up from the French press, surprised by the question, by the tone of something that might have been concern in his voice. "Yes, sir. The trains weren't running." "You could have called. You could have stayed home." Sophia wiped her hands on her apron, considering how to respond. How could she explain to a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small countries that some things mattered more than convenience? That commitment was a form of integrity that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. "I don't like to disappoint people, Mr. Blackwood," she said finally, turning back to her work. Something shifted in Harrison's chest at her words, a tectonic movement in the landscape of his emotional geography. Here was a woman who had walked through a blizzard for no reason other than her word, her commitment to showing up, while he knew business partners who would abandon deals worth millions over minor inconveniences. The contrast was stark and unsettling. That morning, he ate breakfast without checking his phone once. He tasted Sophia's food, really tasted it, for the first time in years. The eggs were perfect, the hash browns golden and crispy on the outside, fluffy within. But there was something more, something ineffable that elevated the simple ingredients into something approaching art. It was as if each dish carried within it the accumulated wisdom and care of countless meals prepared with love rather than obligation. "This is remarkable," he said quietly, more to himself than to Sophia. She paused in her cleaning, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. "Sir, the breakfast, it's exceptional." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Sophia felt something bloom in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. After 7 years of silence, of being invisible, this small acknowledgement felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as these seeds of recognition were planted, the larger systems of Harrison's world remained unchanged. His sister Caroline, who managed the human resources aspects of his domestic staff, still spoke about Sophia as if she were an appliance, efficient but replaceable. His business associates continued to treat the penthouse kitchen as their personal restaurant, never acknowledging the woman whose hands created their meals. The financial world Harrison inhabited was experiencing unprecedented volatility that spring. Cryptocurrency markets swung wildly, real estate values fluctuated like ocean tides, and several of his major clients faced investigations over dubious offshore investment strategies. The pressure was enormous, the stakes measured in millions of dollars and decades of reputation building. Yet increasingly, Harrison found himself seeking refuge, not in his study with its wall of monitors displaying market data, but in the kitchen, where Sophia's quiet competence provided an anchor of stability in his storm-tossed world. He began asking questions, tentative at first, then with growing curiosity. Where had she learned to cook? What were the origins of the spices she used? How did she achieve such perfect consistency in her roux? Sophia answered carefully, unsure of his motives but grateful for the conversation. She told him about her grandmother's kitchen in the French Quarter, about the cast-iron pots that had been seasoned by generations of women, about the way certain dishes could carry the stories of entire cultures within their flavors. These conversations became the highlight of Sophia's days, though she was careful not to let her guard down completely. Men with Harrison's wealth and power had their own gravitational fields, and she had seen too many domestic workers make the mistake of believing they were more than temporary fixtures in such rarefied atmospheres. Still, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps, finally, her years of dedication were being recognized, that the wall of indifference between them might be cracking. But the universe, as Sophia's grandmother used to say, has its own timing, and sometimes recognition comes only after loss threatens to make it impossible forever. The warning signs had been subtle at first, like the distant rumble of thunder before a summer storm. Harrison's business meetings grew longer and more intense, his phone calls filled with urgent whispers about liquidity issues and margin calls. The cryptocurrency market, which had made him dizzy sums of money over the past year, began to crash with spectacular violence. Bitcoin, which had peaked at nearly $70,000, plummeted to less than $30,000 in a matter of days, wiping out millions from his portfolio. Sophia observed these changes from her position in the kitchen, noting how Harrison's appetite diminished even as his stress levels soared. She began preparing lighter meals, broths, and soups designed to nourish without overwhelming, the same comfort foods her grandmother had made during the lean years after Hurricane Katrina. But she was careful not to comment, not to overstep the boundaries that still existed between them, despite their growing conversations. It was during this turbulent period that Caroline Blackwood decided her brother's household staff needed optimization, as she put it. Caroline was a woman who viewed human relationships through the same lens she used for business transactions. Everything had to generate measurable value. Everything had to contribute to the bottom line. Sophia, in Caroline's estimation, was an expensive luxury during a time when even the wealthy needed to be more strategic about their expenditures. "Harrison, we need to talk about your domestic costs," Caroline announced one morning, her Hermes bag hitting the kitchen counter with the force of a gavel. She spoke as if Sophia weren't standing 3 feet away, as if the woman who had prepared their family's meals for 7 years had suddenly become invisible again. "The markets will recover," Harrison replied, not looking up from his tablet where red numbers cascaded like digital blood. "They always do. Maybe, maybe not. But in the meantime, you're hemorrhaging money on unnecessary services. Did you know you're paying this woman more than most people make in corporate jobs? For what? Cooking eggs and washing dishes?" Sophia's hands stilled on the dish she was drying, her heart beginning to pound with a rhythm she recognized from childhood nightmares. She had heard this conversation before. In other houses, other kitchens, when economic pressures made employers reevaluate the human costs of their comfort. "Sophia's work is," Harrison began, then stopped. How could he explain to his pragmatic sister that Sophia's presence had become essential to his daily functioning in ways that couldn't be measured in profit and loss statements? How could he articulate that her meals had become the one reliable constant in his increasingly chaotic world? Is what? Irreplaceable? Caroline's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Harrison, she makes pasta and soup. Literally anyone can do what she does. You could hire a meal delivery service for a fraction of the cost, or simply eat out more often. The savings would be substantial. The words hit Sophia like physical blows. Anyone can do what she does. The casual dismissal of 7 years, of the love and skill and dedication she poured into every meal, of the artistry that transformed simple ingredients into sustenance for both body and soul, reduced to pasta and soup by a woman who had never created anything more complex than a spreadsheet. Sophia continued her work mechanically, her hands moving through familiar routines while her heart cracked like an egg against stone. She had been foolish to believe that the recent conversations with Harrison meant anything more than a wealthy man's momentary curiosity. She had been naive to think that her years of service, her commitment during the blizzard, her quiet competence in the face of indifference had earned her any real security. "I'll think about it," Harrison said finally, his voice hollow. "Don't think too long," Carolyn replied, gathering her things. "Every day you wait is money down the drain. And honestly, Harrison, you need to start making harder choices if you want to weather this market correction." After Caroline left, the kitchen fell into a silence so complete that Sophia could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She and Harrison remained in their separate spaces, she at the sink, he at the breakfast bar, both pretending to be absorbed in their tasks while the weight of the conversation settled between them like a heavy curtain. Harrison stole glances at Sophia as she worked, noting the rigid set of her shoulders, the careful control of her movements. He wanted to say something, to reassure her that Caroline's words didn't reflect his own feelings, but the language of comfort was foreign to him. His entire adult life had been built around the mastery of numbers and deals, not the navigation of human emotions. He understood how to manipulate markets, how to leverage investments, how to maximize returns on capital, but he had no idea how to tell a woman that her work mattered to him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The days that followed were marked by a terrible politeness, a careful distance that neither acknowledged but both felt. Sophia continued her duties with the same precision as always, but something essential had been drained from her movements. The humming stopped. The small improvisations that had made each meal unique disappeared, replaced by mechanical efficiency. She was still an exceptional cook, but the soul that had animated her work seemed to have retreated, taking shelter behind walls that 7 years of gradual trust building couldn't easily breach. Harrison noticed the change immediately. His meals, while technically perfect, tasted flat, lifeless. The magic that had begun to make him look forward to breakfast, that had started to slow his relentless pace and remind him of simple pleasures, had vanished like morning mist. He found himself eating mechanically again, his attention divided between his food and his financial concerns, the brief island of peace that Sophia's cooking had created in his day, dissolving back into the ceaseless anxiety of wealth management. But pride and habit are powerful forces, and neither Harrison nor Sophia knew how to cross the gulf that Caroline's words had opened between them. They moved around each other like dancers in a choreography of avoidance, each aware of what was being lost but neither equipped to fight for its preservation. The financial pressures continued to mount. Harrison's real estate investments, once as solid as the Manhattan bedrock beneath them, began to show stress fractures as commercial tenants defaulted on leases and residential property values declined. His investment fund, built on decades of careful strategy and calculated risk-taking, faced its first serious threat as panicked clients demanded withdrawals that exceeded liquid reserves. The empire he had built was not crumbling, but it was certainly swaying, and every expense came under scrutiny. Sophia watched it all from her corner of his world, understanding more about financial distress from her grandmother's stories of the Great Depression than Harrison might have expected. She recognized the signs, The way he pushed food around his plate without eating, the dark circles under his eyes, the tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking. She had seen these symptoms before, in men who carried the weight of others' livelihoods on their shoulders, who measured their worth by their ability to provide security in a fundamentally insecure world. Her heart ached for him, even as her own job security hung in the balance. This was perhaps the cruelest irony of her position, that she had come to care for someone who saw her as a line item in a budget rather than a human being deserving of basic consideration. The emotional investment she had made in his well-being was unreciprocated and unrecognized, yet she couldn't simply turn it off like a faucet. As the days passed, Sophia began to prepare. She updated her resume, reached out to former contacts in the domestic service industry, and began to steel herself for the conversation she knew was coming. But even as she prepared for the practical realities of unemployment, she couldn't prepare for the emotional weight of losing not just a job, but a home, not just income, but identity, not just employment, but the daily opportunity to practice the craft that connected her to her grandmother's legacy. The axe would fall soon enough, but until it did, Sophia continued to cook with the same dedication as always, because that's who she was, a woman who showed up, who honored her commitments, who gave her best regardless of whether it was valued or acknowledged. It was a form of integrity that men like Harrison, despite all their wealth and power, still had much to learn about. The end came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the markets opened down another 3% and Harrison's banker called with news that several major clients were threatening to pull their investments entirely. Sophia was preparing his breakfast, the same steel-cut oats with fresh berries that had become his preferred way to start the day, when Caroline arrived unannounced, her expression carrying the grim satisfaction of someone about to solve a difficult problem. "Harrison, I've found you the perfect solution," she announced, not bothering to lower her voice despite Sophia's presence. "There's a meal kit service that caters specifically to high-end clients, 3 meals a day, delivered fresh, prepared by trained chefs. The annual cost is less than half of what you're currently spending on kitchen staff." Sophia's hands continued their work automatically, spooning the oats into Harrison's preferred bowl, arranging the berries in the pattern she had learned he favored, though she doubted he had ever consciously noticed. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, but her expression remained calm, professional. 7 years in this house had taught her to mask her emotions, to remain invisible even when her world was crashing down around her. "Caroline," Harrison said quietly, "we've discussed this. And you said you'd think about it. How much more thinking do you need? Your portfolio has lost $12 million in the past month. Your real estate holdings are underwater. The fund is bleeding clients. This is not the time for sentimental attachments to expensive luxuries." Expensive luxuries. The words hung in the air like acid smoke, burning everything they touched. Sophia had been called many things over the years: domestic staff, kitchen help, the cook, but never a luxury. The designation stung with particular cruelty because it reduced 7 years of dedication, of showing up during blizzards and holidays, of perfecting meals to match unspoken preferences, to nothing more than an indulgence that could be discarded when times got tough. "The service comes highly recommended," Carolyn continued, pulling out her phone to show Harrison something on the screen. "Look at these reviews. Restaurant-quality food delivered to your door. Eliminates the hassle of managing domestic staff. Perfect for busy executives who demand excellence without the overhead." Sophia set Harrison's breakfast in front of him, the same breakfast she had prepared more than 2,000 times over the years, each one crafted with the same attention to detail, the same quiet pride in her work. She had learned exactly how he preferred his coffee. Dark roast, no cream, just enough sugar to take the edge off the bitterness. She had memorized his preferences for everything from the temperature of his soup to the way he liked his vegetables cut. No algorithm could replicate that level of personalized service, but apparently algorithms were more cost-effective than human beings. Harrison looked up at Sophia as she placed the coffee beside his bowl, and for a moment their eyes met. She saw something there, regret perhaps, or recognition of what was being lost, but she also saw resignation, the look of a man who had made his decision, even if he lacked the courage to announce it himself. "Sophia," Caroline said, finally acknowledging her presence, "we need to discuss your transition timeline." The euphemism was particularly cruel. Transition timeline, as if being fired were merely a change of direction rather than the destruction of livelihood and purpose. As if 7 years of service could be reduced to a calendar entry and a final paycheck. "I see," Sophia said quietly. "When would you like me to leave?" "End of the month should give us adequate time to implement the new system. That's 2 weeks' notice, which is generous under the circumstances." Generous. Sophia almost smiled at that. Generous would have been recognition of her contributions. Generous would have been a conversation rather than a summary judgment. Generous would have been acknowledgement that she was more than just a line item in a budget spreadsheet. But Sophia had lived too long and seen too much to expect generosity from people who measured worth in profit margins. She nodded, her expression carefully neutral, despite the chaos raging in her chest. "I understand. I'll begin preparing for the transition." Harrison said nothing. He ate his breakfast mechanically, his eyes focused on his tablet where financial disasters played out in real-time market fluctuations. Sophia wondered if he tasted the food at all, if he recognized that this might be one of the last meals she would prepare for him, if he understood what was being sacrificed on the altar of his financial anxieties. After Caroline left, the kitchen fell into a familiar silence, but this time it felt different, heavier, more final. Sophia began her usual morning routines, but each task felt weighted with significance. The last time she would clean these particular dishes, the last time she would organize these specific shelves, the last time she would stand at this window and look out over Central Park while planning the day's meals. Harrison lingered longer than usual, seemingly reluctant to leave for his office. Several times he started to speak, then stopped, as if the words he needed were written in a language he had never learned. Finally, he simply said, "The breakfast was excellent, as always." It was perhaps the most inadequate thing he could have said, yet Sophia understood it was likely the best he could offer. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." He left then, taking with him the last pretense that things between them would ever return to what they had been. Sophia was alone in the kitchen that had been her domain for 7 years, surrounded by the expensive equipment that would soon be used by someone else, or perhaps not used at all if Caroline's meal delivery service proved adequate to Harrison's needs. For the first time since she had arrived at the penthouse, Sophia allowed herself to truly grieve. Not just for the loss of her job, though that was devastating enough, but for the loss of purpose, identity, connection. This kitchen had been more than her workplace. It had been the place where she practiced the craft her grandmother had taught her, where she transformed simple ingredients into expressions of care and comfort. It had been the place where, despite all the indifference and lack of recognition, she had been able to give freely of herself day after day. Now it would become just another room in a wealthy man's apartment, perhaps filled with pre-packaged meals that carried no history, no personal touch, no love. The thought broke something in Sophia's heart that she wasn't sure could be repaired. But Sophia had inherited more than just cooking skills from her grandmother. She had inherited resilience, the ability to endure loss without losing herself, to face disappointment without surrendering hope. She dried her tears, straightened her shoulders, and began to plan for whatever came next, even though she couldn't yet imagine what that might be. She had 2 weeks to finish what she had started 7 years ago, to pour her heart into every meal, to give her best regardless of whether it was valued, to honor the legacy of love and service that had been passed down to her through generations of women who had found dignity and purpose in the simple act of nourishing others. If this was to be her goodbye to Harrison Blackwood's world, it would be a goodbye worthy of everything she had invested in it. The final 2 weeks passed with surreal normalcy. as if the fundamental change approaching their lives was just another seasonal transition. Sophia continued her routines with mechanical precision, but everyone in the penthouse could feel the difference. The light in the kitchen seemed dimmer somehow, the aromas less inviting. The entire atmosphere charged with the electricity of impending loss. Harrison found himself studying Sophia's movements with new attention, trying to memorize details he had never bothered to notice before. The way she tested seasoning with a small spoon, tasting and adjusting until the balance was perfect. The grace with which she handled knives, her hands moving with the confidence of decades of practice. The small, unconscious hum she made when a dish was coming together exactly as she envisioned. These were the elements that no meal delivery service could replicate, the human touches that transformed cooking from mere food preparation into something approaching art. He watched her prepare his morning coffee and realized he had never learned how she achieved that perfect balance of strength and smoothness. Soon he would be making his own coffee or relying on whatever the new service provided, and he suspected neither option would match what Sophia created effortlessly each morning. The thought filled him with a peculiar anxiety, as if he were about to lose something essential whose value he had only begun to appreciate. Sophia, for her part, threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, as if she could somehow compress 7 years of dedication into these final days. She prepared elaborate dinners Harrison didn't request, tested new recipes she had been meaning to try, filled the penthouse with aromas that seemed designed to linger in memory long after she was gone. It was her way of saying goodbye, of leaving something of herself in this space that had consumed so much of her life. On her second-to-last day, Sophia did something she had never done before. She prepared a meal for herself in Harrison's kitchen, not just sampling ingredients or testing seasonings, but actually cooking something for her own pleasure, her own nourishment. She made her grandmother's jambalaya, the version with andouille sausage and Gulf shrimp that carried within it the entire history of her family's journey from France to Louisiana to New York. Harrison found her there that evening, sitting at the kitchen counter with a bowl of rice and a collection of flavors that made his mouth water from across the room. She looked up, startled, as if caught in some transgression, but he gestured for her to continue eating. "That smells incredible," he said, and meant it. "It's my grandmother's recipe," Sophia replied, her voice carrying a warmth he rarely heard directed at him. She used to say it was the only dish that could cure homesickness. "Are you homesick, Sophia?" The question surprised them both. Harrison had not meant to ask something so personal, and Sophia was not prepared for such directness from a man who typically communicated in monosyllables and financial terminology. "Sometimes," she admitted. "New York has been good to me, but Louisiana is where I learned who I was supposed to be." Harrison nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood. His identity was built around accumulation and achievement, around the ability to generate wealth and exercise power. Sophia's identity seemed rooted in something more fundamental, the ability to create comfort, to nourish others, to maintain connections to history and tradition that transcended geography and circumstances. "Would you?" he began, then stopped, uncertain how to frame the request. "Could I try some?" Sophia looked at him with surprise, then smiled. The first genuine smile he had seen from her in months. She prepared a bowl with the same care she put into all her cooking, adjusting the proportions to account for his preferences, which she somehow knew despite never having cooked this particular dish for him before. Harrison took his first bite and felt something shift in his understanding of what food could be. This wasn't just sustenance or even pleasure. This was storytelling, memory-keeping, culture-sharing. Each grain of rice carried within it the accumulated wisdom of generations. Each piece of sausage was seasoned with history. Each shrimp contained the salt of distant waters and the labor of countless hands. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly. "Thank you," Sophia replied, and they ate together in companionable silence for the first time in 7 years. After that meal, something changed between them. Not enough to alter the fundamental trajectory they were on. Sophia would still leave. The meal service would still replace her. The financial pressures that had driven this decision remained unchanged. But a door had been opened, a recognition had been shared, an acknowledgement of what was being lost had passed between them. On Sophia's last morning, she arrived at the customary time and prepared Harrison's breakfast exactly as she had done thousands of times before. But this time, she also prepared a final gift, a detailed notebook containing every recipe she had perfected during her time in his kitchen, complete with notes about his preferences, seasonal variations, and the small touches that made each dish special. She left the notebook on the counter beside his breakfast, along with a simple note written in her careful handwriting. "Thank you for allowing me to cook for you. I hope these recipes bring you comfort in the days to come." Harrison found the notebook after Sophia had gone, along with keys to the penthouse and a forwarding address in Queens where final paperwork could be sent. He flipped through pages filled with Sophia's meticulous documentation of 7 years of meals, realizing for the first time the depth of attention and care that had gone into every dish she had prepared for him. The penthouse felt different immediately, emptier, colder, less alive. The expensive equipment remained, the marble countertops still gleamed, the Sub-Zero refrigerator still hummed quietly in the corner. But the soul of the space had departed with Sophia, leaving behind only the shell of functionality without the warmth of human investment. Harrison tried the meal delivery service Caroline had arranged. The food was professionally prepared, nutritionally balanced, and aesthetically pleasing. It was everything Caroline had promised, except that it tasted like nothing at all, like sustenance without story, like fuel without feeling. After 3 days of eating meals that satisfied his hunger but left his heart empty, Harrison understood what he had lost, though by then it seemed too late to reclaim it. Those were the darkest days, when the full weight of his mistake became clear, but the path to redemption remained hidden, when morning coffee tasted bitter, no matter how much sugar he added. When the silence in his kitchen echoed with the ghost of Sophia's humming, when he finally understood that some forms of wealth cannot be measured in portfolios and property values, and some forms of poverty persist despite millions in assets. The realization of what he had lost would torment Harrison for months to come, but it would also plant the seeds of the transformation that would eventually lead him back to Sophia, back to the recognition of what truly mattered, back to the understanding that the most valuable things in life are often the ones we notice only after they're gone. Harrison's penthouse had become a mausoleum of efficiency, where perfectly prepared meals arrived on schedule and disappeared without ceremony, leaving behind no lingering aromas, no warmth, no sense that nourishment was anything more than the mechanical conversion of calories into energy. The meal delivery service Caroline had selected was everything she had promised: convenient, cost-effective, and utterly soulless. 3 months into this new arrangement, Harrison realized he was losing weight, not from illness or intentional dieting, but from a gradual loss of interest in food that he didn't understand until he caught himself staring at a delivered meal, some kind of Mediterranean grain bowl with perfectly proportioned vegetables and protein, and feeling nothing. No anticipation, no pleasure, just the grim necessity of consumption. He ate because his body required fuel, not because the act brought him any joy or comfort. The financial pressures that had driven Sophia's dismissal had begun to ease. The cryptocurrency market had stabilized, his real estate holdings were showing signs of recovery, and several new clients had signed substantial investment contracts. His net worth was climbing back toward its previous peaks, yet Harrison felt poorer than he had in years. He had gained financial security at the cost of something he was only now beginning to understand had been precious. It was during this period of hollow prosperity that Harrison began to dream about food. Not the exotic cuisines of celebrity chefs or the innovative preparations featured in culinary magazines, but simple, honest meals that carried within them the warmth of human care. He dreamed about Sophia's cornbread, about the way steam rose from her soups like visible comfort, about the sound of her knife against the cutting board in the early morning darkness. He would wake from these dreams with a hunger that no delivered meal could satisfy, a longing for something that couldn't be ordered or purchased. His sister Caroline, pleased with the efficiency of the new system, occasionally checked in to confirm that the transition had been successful. "The cost savings are remarkable," she would say, reviewing the monthly statements, "and no more personnel management issues. It's exactly what I predicted." Harrison would nod and agree, because arguing with Caroline required energy he didn't possess and emotional vocabulary he had never developed. But privately, he began to understand that some forms of efficiency came at costs that couldn't be calculated in spreadsheets, that optimization could sometimes mean the systematic removal of everything that made life worth living. He found himself walking past the kitchen at odd hours, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name. The space looked exactly as it always had, pristine, well-equipped, ready for use. But it felt abandoned, like a stage after the actors had gone home, where all the props remained, but the magic had departed. Sometimes he would stand at the counter where Sophia used to work, trying to remember the specific movements of her hands, the particular way she had arranged ingredients before beginning to cook. The notebook she had left became his most treasured possession, though he was almost afraid to use it. Her recipes were written with the precision of a scientist and the poetry of an artist, each entry revealing new depths of knowledge and care he had never recognized. "Harrison prefers his vegetables slightly undercooked," read one note. "He won't eat fish on Mondays. Never asked why, but noticed the pattern after 2 years." These observations, accumulated over 7 years of quiet attention, painted a picture of dedication that shamed him. Harrison had always prided himself on his analytical abilities, his capacity to recognize patterns and extract value from complex data sets. Yet he had completely failed to recognize the patterns in his own life, the systematic way Sophia had studied his preferences and adjusted her cooking accordingly, the daily evidence of someone who cared enough to pay attention when he himself had been oblivious. One evening, unable to bear another delivered meal, Harrison attempted to cook something for himself using one of Sophia's recipes. He chose something simple, her version of scrambled eggs with herbs, figuring that even he couldn't ruin something so basic. But as he stood in his kitchen with Sophia's notebook open beside him, he realized he lacked not just culinary skills, but understanding of the fundamental language of cooking. What did "cook until just set" mean? How could he tell when butter was properly heated? Sophia's instructions assumed knowledge he had never bothered to acquire. The eggs turned out rubbery and over-salted, nothing like the silky perfection Sophia had created effortlessly each morning. Harrison ate them anyway, partly from hunger and partly from a perverse desire to experience his own incompetence, to understand just how much skill and knowledge went into tasks he had dismissed as simple. The meal was a disaster, but it was also the first food he had genuinely tasted in months, the first time eating had engaged his full attention rather than serving as background activity to checking financial reports. That failed attempt at cooking marked the beginning of Harrison's education in his own helplessness. He tried other recipes from Sophia's notebook, each attempt revealing new layers of his ignorance about the fundamental processes that had sustained his daily life. He burned sauces, overcooked vegetables, misunderstood timing, confused measurements. Every failure was a testament to Sophia's expertise, a recognition of skills he had never valued because they had been performed by someone he had never truly seen. It was during one of these culinary disasters, an attempt at Sophia's seafood gumbo that had somehow transformed into an inedible brown sludge, that Harrison's doorman, Miguel, knocked on his door with a package delivery. Miguel was a man in his 50s who had worked in the building for over a decade, someone Harrison barely acknowledged despite hundreds of daily interactions. "Smells like you're having some trouble in there, Mr. Blackwood," Miguel said with the kind of gentle humor that comes from years of observing the wealthy struggle with basic life skills. "I'm experimenting," Harrison replied, embarrassed by the smoke drifting from his kitchen. "My mother used to say cooking was like love. You can't fake it and you can't rush it," Miguel said. Takes time to learn. And you got to be patient with yourself. It was a simple comment, but it struck Harrison with unexpected force. Miguel's mother, another woman who had probably spent decades cooking for others without recognition, another Sophia in a different kitchen in a different life. How many such women existed in the city around him, in the country, in the world? How many hands shaped daily bread, stirred nightly soups, prepared morning coffee for people too busy or self-important to notice the care that went into these fundamental acts of service? That night, Harrison sat in his pristine dining room eating another delivered meal and thinking about love and time and patience and the countless ways he had failed to recognize the daily gifts that had sustained his life. Sophia had been just the most recent in a long line of people, housekeepers, drivers, doormen, delivery workers, service providers of all kinds, who had made his comfort possible while remaining invisible to his conscious awareness. The weight of this recognition was crushing. Harrison had built his fortune on his ability to identify value, to recognize assets and opportunities that others overlooked. Yet he had lived for 7 years with a woman whose skills and dedication represented extraordinary value, and he had not only failed to recognize it, but had ultimately discarded it for the sake of marginal cost savings. It was perhaps the worst investment decision of his career, measured not in financial returns, but in human terms. As autumn arrived and the days grew shorter, Harrison found himself spending more time alone with his regrets, understanding finally what Sophia had given him and what he had thrown away. The empty spaces in his life had grown so large that even his returning wealth felt insignificant by comparison. He had everything money could buy, and nothing money couldn't. A man rich in assets, but impoverished in all the ways that actually mattered. The first snow of winter reminded him of that morning when Sophia had walked through the blizzard to prepare his breakfast, when she had arrived soaked and shivering because her commitment to her work had superseded her concern for her own comfort. That memory, once barely noticed, now seemed to contain everything he needed to understand about character and dedication and the quiet heroism of people who simply showed up day after day, regardless of whether their efforts were acknowledged or appreciated. It was then that Harrison finally admitted to himself what he had lost was irreplaceable, and that the only question remaining was whether it was too late to find his way back to something approaching redemption. The journey would be longer and more difficult than he could imagine, but at least he had finally found the courage to begin it. Winter deepened its grip on Manhattan, and with it came a peculiar form of clarity for Harrison Blackwood. The financial chaos that had precipitated Sophia's dismissal was now mostly resolved. His cryptocurrency investments had recovered spectacularly as markets rebounded. His real estate portfolio was generating solid returns again, and his wealth management firm had not only retained its major clients, but attracted several new ones with substantial investment capital. By any measurable standard, he was more successful than ever, his net worth approaching levels that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Yet, success felt hollow without anyone to share it with, and wealth felt meaningless when it couldn't restore what he had lost through his own short-sightedness. Harrison found himself lying awake at night, not worrying about margin calls or market volatility, but thinking about Sophia's hands kneading dough, about the way she had hummed while working, about the particular satisfaction he had felt when eating meals prepared with actual care rather than corporate efficiency. The meal delivery service Caroline had arranged was still functioning flawlessly, providing nutritionally balanced and aesthetically pleasing food on schedule exactly as promised. But Harrison had begun to understand that efficiency and nourishment were not the same thing, that sustenance involved more than just calories and nutrients. He needed food that carried within it some trace of human intention, some indication that someone had thought about his well-being while preparing it. The delivered meals, for all their technical proficiency, tasted like assembly line products designed to meet specifications rather than to bring pleasure or comfort. It was during one of his increasingly frequent walks through Central Park, a new habit born partly from restlessness and partly from a desire to escape the tomb-like quiet of his penthouse, that Harrison encountered Mrs. Chen, his former housekeeper, walking a small dog he didn't recognize. Mrs. Chen had departed shortly after Sophia's dismissal, claiming she wanted to spend more time with her grandchildren, though Harrison suspected the real reason had been her unwillingness to witness the systematic dismantling of the domestic harmony she had helped maintain for years. "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Chen said with polite surprise, "how are you managing on your own?" The question was innocent enough, but it struck Harrison as profoundly loaded. How was he managing? Financially, exceptionally well. Practically, adequately. Emotionally, he was barely surviving, though he lacked the vocabulary to express this to someone he had never had a real conversation with, despite years of daily interaction. "Things are different," he said carefully. Mrs. Chen nodded with the wisdom of someone who had observed the consequences of his decisions from a perspective he had never considered. "Miss Sophia. She was special, very talented cook, very kind person. We all knew the house wouldn't be the same without her." "You stay in touch with her?" "Oh yes, she comes to my church sometimes. She's doing well, working at a restaurant in Queens now. But I think she misses cooking for a family, you know? There's something different about cooking for people you care about versus cooking for customers you never see." The conversation was brief. Mrs. Chen was clearly uncomfortable discussing his former employees with him, but it left Harrison with more questions than answers. Where exactly in Queens was Sophia working? Was she happy? Did she ever think about her time in his kitchen, or had she moved on entirely from that chapter of her life? Most importantly, had he damaged their potential relationship so thoroughly with his callousness that any attempt at reconnection would be unwelcome? That night, Harrison did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He took the subway to Queens, not the comfortable, familiar subway line he occasionally used for business meetings in Brooklyn, but the working-class trains that carried domestic workers and restaurant staff and all the other people whose labor sustained the comfortable lives of Manhattan's wealthy residents. He had no specific destination in mind, no plan beyond the vague hope of somehow encountering Sophia or finding clues about her new life. The journey was revelatory in ways he hadn't expected. The subway car was filled with people returning from work, tired-looking women in comfortable shoes carrying shopping bags, men in food service uniforms checking their phones, teenagers with earbuds studying for exams. These were the people who cleaned his building, who prepared food in the restaurants he frequented, who provided the countless services that made his lifestyle possible. Yet he had never really seen them as individuals with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams and disappointments. Harrison wandered through Queens neighborhoods he had never visited, past small restaurants and food trucks that filled the air with aromas more appealing than anything his meal delivery service had ever provided. He found himself stopping to read menus posted in restaurant windows, searching for familiar dishes from Sophia's repertoire, hoping to catch some trace of her influence in the culinary landscape of her adopted borough. He didn't find Sophia that night, but the journey changed something in his perspective. For the first time in his adult life, Harrison began to understand the geography of inequality that shaped New York, the vast distances, economic, social, emotional, that separated his penthouse from the modest apartments where people like Sophia built their actual lives. He began to comprehend how presumptuous it had been to expect loyalty and dedication from someone whose entire existence he had never bothered to acknowledge or understand. Over the following weeks, Harrison found himself making more trips to Queens, approaching his search with the same methodical patience he applied to financial research. He learned the names of neighborhoods, Astoria, Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, and began to understand the ethnic enclaves and immigrant communities that gave each area its distinct character. He ate in family-owned restaurants where the food was prepared with obvious care and attention, where recipes carried within them the stories of journeys from distant countries to New York kitchens. It was in one of these restaurants, a modest Salvadoran place in Corona, that Harrison finally picked up Sophia's trail. The owner, an elderly woman who had clearly been cooking professionally for decades, recognized his description and confirmed that Sophia had worked there briefly, filling in for a cook who had returned to El Salvador to care for her mother. "She was here maybe 2 months," the woman said in careful English. "Very good cook, very respectful. She learned some of our recipes, taught us some of hers. But she moved on to something better. Got a job at a nicer restaurant where she could use more of her skills. Do you know where? Somewhere in Long Island City, I think. A new place, American food with Southern influences. The owner, he came here looking for experienced cooks, and we recommended Sophia right away. She deserved something better than filling in for missing people." The lead was promising, but Long Island City was a large area with dozens of restaurants, and Harrison wasn't even sure what kind of establishment he was looking for. He spent several weekends exploring the neighborhood, checking out restaurants that specialized in Southern cuisine or advertised American comfort food, but found no trace of Sophia's presence. It was beginning to seem like a hopeless quest when Harrison made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing financial records for a real estate investment, he noticed that one of his properties, a commercial building in Long Island City that he had acquired as part of a larger portfolio deal, was leased to a restaurant called Magnolia Kitchen. The name meant nothing to him, but something about the location seemed familiar. When he checked the address against his notes from his Queens wanderings, he realized he had walked past the building several times without paying attention to what was inside. That Saturday morning, Harrison took the subway to Long Island City with a sense of nervous anticipation he hadn't felt since his first major financial investment decades earlier. He found Magnolia Kitchen easily, a small, warm-looking restaurant with large windows that revealed a dining room filled with mismatched tables and chairs, walls decorated with vintage photographs, and the kind of casual, welcoming atmosphere that suggested food prepared with care rather than pretension. Through the window, he could see into the kitchen, where a familiar figure moved with the same graceful efficiency he remembered from his penthouse. Sophia was there, her hair covered by a colorful bandana, her hands working quickly and confidently as she prepared what looked like a complex sauce. She was talking to someone outside his field of vision, her face animated in a way he had rarely seen during their years of shared but unequal space. Harrison stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, paralyzed by the recognition of how different Sophia looked in this environment. She was clearly in charge of this kitchen, moving with authority and confidence, her skills fully utilized and visibly appreciated. The contrast with her role in his penthouse was stark and painful. Here she was a chef, a professional, a creative force, rather than simply a service provider invisible to those who benefited from her work. The question now was whether he had the courage to walk through the door, to risk the conversation that might finally lead to understanding or possibly to final rejection. Harrison had built his fortune on calculated risks, but this felt more dangerous than any financial gamble he had ever made, because the stakes were measured not in money but in possibilities for redemption he might not deserve. Taking a deep breath that felt like the first one he had taken in months, Harrison Blackwood opened the door to Magnolia Kitchen, stepped inside, and prepared to discover whether some mistakes could be acknowledged, some losses might be recoverable, and some forms of wealth could be earned rather than simply accumulated. The warmth hit Harrison immediately as he entered Magnolia Kitchen, not just the physical warmth of a busy restaurant, but something deeper, more essential. The air was thick with the aromas of slow-cooked meats and simmering vegetables, of fresh bread and caramelized onions, of spices and herbs combining in harmonies that spoke of genuine care and culinary expertise. It was everything his sterile penthouse kitchen had never been, and everything he hadn't realized he was missing. The lunch rush was in full swing, but the atmosphere was unhurried, comfortable. Customers seemed to linger over their meals, engaged in conversation, clearly savoring both food and experience. Harrison found a small table near the window and picked up a menu that was refreshingly simple. No pretentious descriptions or exotic ingredients, just honest, Southern-influenced American food prepared with obvious skill and attention. "Welcome to Magnolia," said a young waitress with a genuine smile. "First time here?" "Yes," Harrison replied, his voice slightly hoarse with nervousness. "I've heard good things about your chef." "Sophia's amazing," the waitress said with obvious affection. "She's only been with us 6 months, but it's like she was always meant to be here. The owner practically begged her to join us after he tasted her cooking at another place." "Lucky for us," she said yes. Harrison ordered several dishes: jambalaya, cornbread, collard greens, blackened catfish, partially because he was hungry, but mostly because he wanted to taste Sophia's cooking in this new environment, to understand how her skills had evolved when given proper acknowledgement and creative freedom. When the food arrived, Harrison understood immediately why Magnolia Kitchen was thriving. Every dish was a masterpiece of flavor and technique, but more than that, each plate carried within it the unmistakable signature of someone who cooked with passion rather than mere professionalism. The jambalaya was Sophia's grandmother's recipe, he realized, the same one she had shared with him during one of their few genuine conversations. But here it was, refined, elevated, presented with the confidence of a chef who knew her worth and had the platform to demonstrate it. As Harrison ate, he watched the kitchen through the service window, observing Sophia in her element. She moved with ballet-like precision, orchestrating multiple dishes simultaneously, tasting and adjusting seasonings with the expertise of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft. But more than her technical skill, it was her obvious joy that struck him most forcefully. She was laughing with her kitchen staff, high-fiving a cook who had executed a particularly challenging preparation, mentoring a younger employee with patient encouragement. This was Sophia as she was meant to be, not invisible, not diminished, not reduced to a line item in someone else's budget, but fully realized, acknowledged, celebrated. The contrast with her former role in his household was devastating. Harrison realized that by treating Sophia as a servant rather than as the skilled professional she was, he had not only wasted her talents, but actively diminished her humanity. She had been capable of this level of excellence, this kind of leadership and creativity, during all the years she had worked for him, but his limited vision had constrained her to the role of invisible food preparer rather than celebrated chef. After finishing his meal, every bite a revelation of flavor and technique that shamed his memory of the efficient but soulless delivery service he now relied on, Harrison sat in his chair, trying to summon the courage for what he knew he had to do next. He had to talk to Sophia, had to acknowledge what he had failed to see, had to try to bridge the enormous gulf his callousness had created between them. The lunch crowd was beginning to thin when Harrison finally approached the service counter. Sophia was visible in the kitchen, putting finishing touches on a plate that looked like a work of art. She hadn't noticed him yet, which gave Harrison a few moments to study her face in repose. She looked older than he remembered, but also somehow younger. The lines of stress and quiet resignation that had marked her features in his kitchen had been replaced by expression of satisfaction and professional pride. "Excuse me," Harrison said to the young man working the register. "Could you tell Chef Sophia that Harrison Blackwood would like to speak with her, if she has a moment?" The young man looked slightly puzzled. Harrison was clearly not a typical Magnolia Kitchen customer with his expensive suit and nervous demeanor, but he nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Harrison watched through the service window as the message was delivered, saw Sophia's hands still on the plate she was preparing, saw her body language change as she processed the information. For a long moment, Sophia didn't move. Then she said something to her staff, removed her apron, and walked toward the dining room. As she approached, Harrison was struck again by the transformation in her bearing. This was not the deferential domestic worker he remembered, but a professional chef on her own territory, confident in her skills and secure in her position. "Mr. Blackwood," Sophia said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "Hello, Sophia." Harrison stood, unsure whether to extend his hand or how to navigate this conversation he had rehearsed in his mind countless times, but never quite prepared for in reality. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "I have a few minutes between services. Would you like to sit?" They chose a table away from the few remaining customers, creating a small bubble of privacy in the busy restaurant. Sophia waited for Harrison to speak, her expression patient but guarded, clearly curious about his presence but not willing to make it easy for him. "Your restaurant is remarkable," Harrison began. "The food is extraordinary. I can see why you've been so successful here." "Thank you," Sophia replied. "I've been fortunate to find a place where I can really cook, where my work is valued." The implied contrast was obvious, and Harrison felt it like a physical blow. He deserved it, he knew, but it still hurt to have his failures so clearly illuminated. "Sophia, I came here because I need to apologize to you for everything, for not seeing your talent, for not appreciating your dedication, for treating you like—" He struggled for words that could adequately express the depth of his regret. "For treating you as if you didn't matter, when you mattered more than almost anything else in my life, and I was too blind to realize it." Sophia's expression remained carefully composed, but Harrison thought he saw a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, or pain, or possibly just the recognition of how long overdue this acknowledgement was. "I don't need apologies, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly. "I need respect, and I found it here. I need to be seen for who I am and what I can do, and I have that now. I need to work somewhere that values my contributions, and this place does that every day." "I know," Harrison said. "I can see that. And I'm grateful that you found this, that you have the recognition you always deserved. But I also need you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life, and not just because the food was better when you cooked for me. Because you brought something to my home that I didn't know I needed, and when you left, I finally understood what I had thrown away." Sophia studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine or simply the self-serving platitudes of a wealthy man accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm and money. "What do you want from me, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked finally. "Why are you here?" It was the question Harrison had been dreading, because he wasn't entirely sure of the answer himself. What did he want? Her forgiveness? Her return to his kitchen? A relationship that acknowledged her humanity rather than treating her as invisible? All of those things and more, but he suspected that most of his desires were no longer possible, that too much damage had been done for simple repair. "I want to understand," he said finally. "I want to learn from my mistakes. I want to know if there's any way I can make amends for the years I wasted your time and ignored your gifts. And I want you to know that your work, your presence in my home, meant more to me than I was ever able to express, and losing it has taught me lessons I needed to learn but was too proud to accept." Sophia's demeanor softened slightly at these words, though her guard remained up. Harrison could see her processing his statement, weighing it against 7 years of experience that had taught her not to expect much from wealthy employers. "I appreciate you saying that," she said carefully. "It's more than you ever said when I worked for you, and it means something to hear it now. But Mr. Blackwood, I've moved on. I have a life here, work that challenges me, people who value what I do. I'm not looking backward anymore." Harrison nodded, understanding the justice in her response, but feeling the sting of finality in her words. He had come here hoping for something, forgiveness, reconciliation, a second chance. But he was beginning to realize that some opportunities, once lost, cannot be reclaimed through good intentions and belated recognition. "I understand," he said. "I'm grateful you're willing to talk with me at all. I know I don't deserve even that much." He paused, then decided to risk one more request. "Could I ask you something? Would you be willing to teach me to cook? Not to come back to my kitchen, not to work for me again, but to share some of what you know? I have your recipe notebook, but I don't have the understanding that makes those recipes come alive. I'd pay you, of course, but more than that, I'd finally get to learn from someone I should have been learning from all along." The request surprised them both. Harrison hadn't planned to ask for cooking lessons, but something about sitting in Sophia's domain, tasting her food prepared with proper appreciation and support, had made him realize how little he understood about the craft that had sustained his daily life for years. Sophia considered the request carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. Finally, she looked directly at Harrison for the first time since sitting down, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of possibility he hadn't dared hope for. "Let me think about it, Mr. Blackwood. That's not a simple request, and I'm not sure what it would accomplish for either of us, but I'm willing to consider it if you're serious about wanting to learn rather than just trying to ease your conscience." "I'm serious," Harrison assured her, "more serious than I've been about anything in a long time." Sophia nodded, then glanced at her watch. "I need to get back to the kitchen now. The dinner prep won't do itself." They stood together, and for a moment the years of shared but unequal history hung between them, like a bridge neither was quite sure how to cross. Finally, Sophia extended her hand, and Harrison shook it, feeling the calluses and strength that came from decades of professional cooking. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Blackwood," she said, "and thank you for finally saying what you should have said years ago. It doesn't change the past, but it makes the future seem a little more hopeful." As Harrison walked back to the subway, he carried with him the taste of Sophia's cooking and the possibility that some forms of redemption might still be within his reach. He had found her, had spoken the words he needed to say, and while he couldn't undo the damage of the past, he might yet have the chance to demonstrate that he had finally learned to value what had always been precious, even when he had been too blind to see it. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, Harrison felt something approaching hope, seasoned with the hard-won understanding that the most important lessons in life often come disguised as loss, and that sometimes the greatest wealth lies in finally learning to recognize the gifts that have been in front of us all along. 3 days after his visit to Magnolia Kitchen, Harrison received a text message from an unknown number. "This is Sophia. If you're still interested in cooking lessons, we can discuss terms. Are you free this Saturday at 2 p.m.? I can meet you somewhere neutral to talk about what this would involve." Harrison stared at the message for several minutes, reading it over and over to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. After months of regret and failed attempts to fill the void Sophia's absence had created in his life, the possibility of reconnection, even in this limited form, felt almost too good to be true. He responded immediately, agreeing to meet wherever she preferred, and spent the rest of the week in a state of nervous anticipation he hadn't experienced since his first major business presentation decades earlier. Saturday found Harrison waiting at a coffee shop in Long Island City, arriving 15 minutes early because his anxiety wouldn't allow him to risk being late. He had chosen his outfit carefully, wanting to strike the right balance between respectful and approachable, settling on casual trousers and a sweater that made him look less like a financial executive and more like someone who might actually belong in a kitchen. Sophia arrived precisely on time, looking relaxed and professional in jeans and a simple blouse, her confidence evident in the way she carried herself. She had clearly thought carefully about this meeting, and Harrison suspected she had conditions and boundaries prepared that would determine whether their renewed acquaintance could move forward. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Harrison said as they settled at a corner table with their coffee. "I know this must seem like an unusual request." "It is unusual," Sophia agreed. "In 7 years of working for you, you never showed any interest in cooking or what went into preparing your meals. Now, suddenly you want to learn? I have to ask, what changed?" Harrison had anticipated this question, but still found it difficult to answer with the honesty it deserved. How could he explain the gradual erosion of satisfaction in his life? The way delivered meals had made him realize that nourishment involved more than just sustenance. The dreams about food that had haunted his nights since she left. "Losing you made me understand how much I had taken for granted," he said finally. "Not just your cooking, but your knowledge, your skill, your dedication. For 7 years you created something beautiful every day, and I never bothered to learn how you did it or why it mattered. Now I eat food that has no soul, no story, no connection to anything meaningful, and I realize I want to understand what you knew all along, that cooking is about more than just feeding people." Sophia studied his face as he spoke, looking for signs of insincerity or self-serving motivation. Harrison met her gaze directly, hoping she could see the genuine regret and curiosity that had driven him to seek her out. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "it wouldn't be like when I worked for you. I would be the teacher, you would be the student. You would have to listen, follow instructions, accept correction when you make mistakes. You would have to respect the knowledge I'm sharing with you, even when it comes from someone without formal culinary training or expensive degrees." "I understand," Harrison replied. "I want to learn from you, not have you work for me." The relationship would be completely different. "And expensive," Sophia continued. "I charge $75 an hour for private cooking instruction, plus the cost of ingredients. This would be a professional service, not a favor or an attempt to recreate our old arrangement." Harrison nodded without hesitation. $75 an hour was less than he typically paid for legal consultation or financial advice, and infinitely more valuable than the meal delivery service that had failed to satisfy any of his actual needs. "When would we start?" he asked. "If we start," Sophia corrected. "I need to think about this more. It's complicated, working with someone who hurt me the way you did. I've moved past the anger, but I haven't forgotten how it felt to be invisible in your house, to have my work dismissed, to be thrown away when you decided I wasn't cost-effective anymore." The words hit Harrison like physical blows, but he forced himself to absorb them without defensiveness or explanation. Sophia had every right to express how his treatment had affected her, and if he was truly committed to making amends, he had to be willing to hear the full scope of the damage his blindness had caused. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know that's not enough, but I'm deeply, genuinely sorry for all of it. You deserved so much better than what I gave you, and I understand if you can't trust me enough to try this." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she hadn't yet figured out how to ask. "Let me ask you something," she said finally. "What do you think cooking lessons are going to accomplish? Are you hoping I'll come back to work for you? Are you trying to ease your guilt by throwing money at the problem? Or do you genuinely want to learn something that has nothing to do with our history together?" Harrison considered the question carefully, recognizing that his answer would determine whether this conversation continued or ended permanently. "I think I'm trying to learn how to see," he said. "For years I ate your food without understanding what went into it, lived in a house you made welcoming without recognizing your contribution, benefited from your work without acknowledging your skill. I want to understand what I missed, what I was too arrogant or obtuse to appreciate. And maybe, if I learn enough about what you do and why it matters, I can become someone worthy of having known you, even if it's too late for us to have any kind of meaningful relationship." Sophia's expression softened slightly at these words, though her caution remained evident. "That's a better answer than I expected," she said. "But Harrison, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this to fix whatever's broken in your life. I'm not responsible for filling the emptiness you feel or teaching you how to be human. If we do this, it's because you genuinely want to learn about cooking, about food, about the craft I've spent my life developing. It's not therapy, and it's not a path back to what we used to have." "I understand," Harrison said. "I want to learn for the sake of learning, because you have knowledge and skills that are valuable in themselves, not because I'm trying to manipulate you into anything else." Sophia finished her coffee and sat back in her chair, her decision process clearly weighing multiple factors Harrison couldn't fully comprehend. "All right," she said finally. "We can try it. 6 sessions, 2 weeks apart, in your kitchen since you have better equipment than I can access elsewhere. We start with basics, knife skills, seasoning, understanding how heat affects different ingredients. If you're serious about learning and respectful of what I'm teaching, we can continue. If you revert to treating me like hired help, or if this becomes about anything other than cooking, we stop immediately." "Agreed." Harrison felt something loosen in his chest, a band of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Agreed," he said. When would you like to start? Next Sunday, 2 p.m. I'll bring ingredients for our first lesson, basic knife skills and a simple soup that will teach you about building flavors. You provide the kitchen and your full attention. As they prepared to leave, Sophia turned to him with a final observation. You know, Harrison, the hardest thing about cooking isn't learning the techniques or mastering the recipes. It's learning to pay attention to what you're doing, to what the food is telling you, to how your actions affect the final result. Most people never develop that kind of awareness, which is why they never become good cooks. We'll see if you can learn it. Walking back to his penthouse that afternoon, Harrison understood that Sophia had offered him far more than cooking lessons. She had given him an opportunity to develop the kind of attention and awareness that had been missing from most areas of his life, the capacity to see and value things that couldn't be measured in profit margins or portfolio performance. In 1 week, he would begin learning skills that should have been developing for years, guided by someone who had every reason to refuse him, but had chosen instead to offer him the gift of knowledge. It was, Harrison realized, a form of grace he had never expected and certainly didn't deserve, which made it all the more precious and all the more important not to waste. The week between Sophia's agreement and their first lesson passed with excruciating slowness for Harrison. He found himself researching cooking techniques online, watching YouTube videos about knife skills, reading articles about flavor profiles and seasoning, as if cramming for an exam that would determine his worthiness as a student. But mostly, he thought about the opportunity Sophia had given him and the magnitude of trust her decision represented. Sunday arrived gray and cold, with the kind of February weather that made Manhattan feel like a concrete canyon designed to channel Arctic wind. Harrison had spent the morning cleaning his kitchen obsessively, making sure every surface gleamed, every tool was perfectly organized, every appliance was spotless and ready for use. He wanted Sophia to feel welcomed in the space where she had once been taken for granted, to see that he finally understood the value of what she was offering him. At precisely 2 p.m., the doorman announced her arrival. Harrison met her at the elevator, helping carry 2 large bags of ingredients and equipment she had brought for their lesson. As they entered the penthouse, he watched her face for signs of emotion or recognition, but Sophia maintained her professional demeanor, surveying the kitchen with the eyes of an instructor, evaluating a workspace rather than someone returning to a place of former employment. Good, she said, setting her bags on the counter. Everything's clean and organized. That's the first rule of cooking. Start with a clean kitchen, end with a clean kitchen. Chaos in the workspace leads to chaos in the food. She began unpacking her supplies methodically, vegetables that looked fresher and more vibrant than anything Harrison had seen in months, herbs that filled the air with their fragrance, knives wrapped in protective sleeves that gleamed like surgical instruments. Watching her transform his sterile kitchen into a working culinary space reminded Harrison of the daily magic he had witnessed but never truly appreciated during her years of service. Today we're making vegetable soup, Sophia announced. Simple, basic, but it will teach you fundamental techniques, how to handle a knife properly, how to build flavors in layers, how to taste and adjust seasoning, how to recognize when something is done. Are you ready to work? Harrison nodded, feeling more nervous than he had before any business presentation or financial negotiation in his career. This was different. This was about creating rather than accumulating, about skills that couldn't be delegated or purchased, about learning to pay the kind of attention he had never developed despite its obvious importance. Sophia began with knife skills, showing him how to hold the blade properly, how to position his fingers to avoid injury, how to create uniform cuts that would cook evenly. Her hands moved with practiced grace as she demonstrated, the knife becoming an extension of her will as she transformed a pile of vegetables into precisely diced components. "Your turn," she said, sliding a cutting board in front of him and placing a knife in his hand. "Start with the onion. Remember, rock the knife, don't chop. Let the blade do the work." Harrison's first attempts were clumsy and uneven, producing irregular chunks rather than the neat dice Sophia had created effortlessly. But she was patient, adjusting his grip, correcting his technique, offering gentle guidance without criticism or condescension. "Better," she said after his fifth or sixth attempt. "You're starting to feel the rhythm. Cooking is like music. Once you understand the beat, everything else becomes easier." As Harrison worked through the vegetables, Sophia shared knowledge that went far beyond simple technique. She explained why certain cuts were better for different cooking methods, how the size and shape of ingredients affected their flavor and texture, why some vegetables needed to be added early in the cooking process, while others were better added at the end. "Cooking is about understanding relationships," she said as they moved to the stove to begin building their soup. "How ingredients work together, how heat changes things, how time affects flavor. Most people think it's about following recipes, but recipes are just suggestions. The real skill is learning to listen to what the food is telling you." Harrison found himself completely absorbed in the process. His usual mental chatter about financial markets and investment strategies quieted by the need to focus on immediate, tangible tasks. The simple act of stirring onions until they became translucent required a kind of present-moment attention he rarely experienced, a connection between action and result that was immediate and satisfying in ways his abstract financial work never provided. "Now taste," Sophia instructed, offering him a spoon of the developing soup. "What do you notice?" Harrison tasted carefully, trying to identify the elements he could detect. "It's good," he said tentatively, "but it needs something." "What kind of something?" "I'm not sure. More flavor." "Brightness?" Sophia smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since their reunion at Magnolia Kitchen. "Exactly right. It needs acid to balance the richness, a little lemon juice, maybe some vinegar. Taste again after I add it." The transformation was immediate and dramatic. The same soup, with just a few drops of lemon juice, became something completely different, more complex, more satisfying, more alive. "That's the magic," Sophia said. "Understanding how one small adjustment can change everything. Most home cooks are afraid to taste and adjust, afraid to trust their instincts. But that's where the art happens, in the small decisions you make based on what your senses tell you." They continued working together for nearly 3 hours, Harrison's initial nervousness gradually replaced by genuine fascination with the process. Sophia was an exceptional teacher, demanding but encouraging, precise about technique but forgiving of mistakes, clearly passionate about sharing knowledge she had spent decades accumulating. As their lesson concluded and they sat down to eat the soup they had created together, Harrison realized something had shifted in his understanding of food, of skill, of the relationship between effort and satisfaction. The soup was simple but perfect, carrying within it the accumulated decisions and adjustments they had made throughout the afternoon. It tasted like accomplishment, like attention paid and effort rewarded. "Thank you," Harrison said as they finished eating. "I had no idea cooking involved so much knowledge and skill. I feel like I've been eating blindly my whole life." "Most people do," Sophia replied. "They think food just happens, that it appears on their table through some mysterious process they don't need to understand. But everything you eat was created by someone's hands, someone's knowledge, someone's care. When you learn to cook, you start to appreciate that invisible labor." As Sophia packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, she turned to Harrison with an observation that carried weight beyond their cooking lesson. "You did well today," she said. "You listened, you followed instructions, you asked good questions, you treated this like learning, not like something you were entitled to. If you keep that attitude, you might actually become a decent cook." After she left, Harrison sat in his kitchen, still fragrant with the aromas of their soup making, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, satisfaction that came from creating rather than acquiring, from learning rather than earning, from paying attention to something outside the narrow focus of financial success that had consumed most of his adult life. He had 13 more weeks until their agreed-upon 6 sessions were complete, but already Harrison suspected that Sophia was teaching him far more than cooking techniques. She was introducing him to ways of being in the world he had never explored, forms of attention and care that couldn't be bought or delegated, skills that connected him to fundamental human activities he had somehow managed to live without understanding. For the first time since Sophia had left his employment, Harrison felt genuinely hopeful about the future, not because his wealth was recovering or his business was thriving, but because he was finally learning to see value that existed beyond balance sheets and investment returns, finally developing capacities that made him more human rather than more successful. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of education he had needed his entire life, but had been too arrogant to seek until loss had made him desperate enough to ask for help. The fact that it was coming from someone he had once dismissed made it all the more precious, all the more important to receive, with the gratitude and respect it deserved. The second lesson, 2 weeks later, built upon the foundation Sophia had established with their soup-making session. This time, she arrived with ingredients for what she called the Holy Trinity of Southern cooking, a lesson about the flavor base that had been central to her grandmother's recipes, and by extension, to many of the meals that had sustained Harrison during her years in his employment. Today we learn about the roux, Sophia announced, unpacking flour, oil, and the vegetables that would become the foundation for a proper gumbo. This is probably the most important technique I can teach you, because it's the heart of so much of what I cook, but it requires patience, attention, and respect for the process. You cannot rush a roux. Harrison had eaten Sophia's gumbo countless times during her years of service, but he had never understood the complexity and skill required to create its distinctive flavor and texture. As Sophia demonstrated the careful process of cooking flour and oil together until they achieved the perfect color and aroma, he began to appreciate the level of knowledge and experience that had gone into every bowl she had ever placed before him. The roux has to be the color of a copper penny, Sophia explained, stirring constantly as the mixture slowly darkened. Too light, and you don't get the flavor. Too dark, and you've burned it and have to start over. There's no shortcut, no way to rush it. This is why real gumbo takes time. Harrison tried his hand at the technique, his arm aching from the constant stirring required to prevent burning. The process demanded complete attention. Any lapse in focus could ruin 20 minutes of careful work in seconds. It was a form of meditation he had never experienced, a requirement for present moment awareness that his usual multitasking business mindset couldn't accommodate. I never realized how much skill this required, Harrison said as he stirred, sweat beading on his forehead from the concentration and physical effort. Most people don't, Sophia replied. They think gumbo's just throwing ingredients in a pot, but every step requires knowledge, what temperature to maintain, how to recognize the right color, when to add each ingredient, how to balance the flavors. My grandmother spent 50 years perfecting her technique, and she was still learning when she died. As the lesson progressed, Sophia shared stories about her grandmother, about the kitchen in New Orleans where she had learned these techniques, about the cultural history that lived within recipes, passed down through generations of women who had found ways to create beauty and nourishment even under difficult circumstances. Food is memory, Sophia said as they added vegetables to the darkened roux. Every dish carries stories, where it came from, who made it, why it mattered to the people who ate it. When you cook my grandmother's gumbo, you're participating in something bigger than just making dinner. You're continuing a tradition. Harrison found himself deeply moved by this perspective on cooking he had never considered. His entire life had been focused on individual achievement, on accumulating wealth and power that would distinguish him from others. But Sophia was describing a different kind of value, communal knowledge, shared traditions, the preservation and transmission of cultural wisdom that belonged to everyone who learned to honor it. By the end of their session, they had created a gumbo that rivaled anything Harrison remembered from Sophia's tenure in his kitchen. But more than the final product, it was the process that had transformed his understanding. He had experienced firsthand the patience and skill required, the attention and care that went into every spoonful, the invisible labor that had sustained him for years without his acknowledgement or appreciation. "You're learning," Sophia observed as they tasted the finished gumbo. "Not just the techniques, but the mindset. Cooking isn't about dominance or control. It's about partnership with ingredients, respect for processes, humility in the face of knowledge that's bigger than any individual." The third and fourth lessons continued this education in ways of thinking and being that Harrison had never encountered in his business world. Sophia taught him about seasoning, not just what spices to use, but how to taste and adjust, how to trust his palate, how to understand that cooking was a conversation between the chef and the ingredients, rather than a set of instructions to be followed mechanically. Taste, think, adjust became Sophia's mantra. The recipe is just a starting point. Your job is to pay attention to what's actually happening and respond accordingly. Harrison discovered that this approach to cooking had applications far beyond the kitchen. The willingness to taste and adjust, to respond to feedback rather than rigidly following predetermined plans, was a form of flexibility and responsiveness he had never developed in his business practices. He began to see how his authoritarian approach to managing people and situations had limited his effectiveness in ways he was only now beginning to understand. With each lesson, the relationship between Harrison and Sophia continued to evolve. The initial awkwardness and guardedness gradually gave way to something approaching mutual respect. Sophia began to trust that Harrison was genuinely interested in learning rather than trying to recreate their former dynamic, while Harrison developed a deep appreciation for Sophia's knowledge and teaching abilities that went far beyond his original intention to make amends for past behavior. "You know," Sophia said during their fifth lesson, as they prepared fresh pasta from scratch, "when you first asked about cooking lessons, I thought it was just guilt or some kind of rich man's whim. But you're actually learning. You're developing palate, technique, understanding. It's surprising." "Surprising that I'm capable of learning?" Harrison asked, kneading dough with the rhythm Sophia had taught him. "Surprising that you're willing to be bad at something while you learn to be good at it," Sophia replied. "Most people in your position are too proud to be beginners at anything. They want to buy expertise rather than develop it. But you're actually putting in the work." As they rolled pasta sheets thin enough to read through, Harrison reflected on Sophia's observation. She was right. For most of his adult life, he had avoided situations where he might appear incompetent or unprepared. His wealth had allowed him to hire expertise rather than develop skills, to delegate rather than learn, to maintain the illusion of competence by surrounding himself with people who knew how to do things he had never needed to master. But cooking with Sophia required genuine vulnerability, the willingness to make mistakes in front of someone whose opinion he had come to value deeply. It was perhaps the first time since his early business years that Harrison had allowed himself to be truly taught by someone else, to acknowledge gaps in his knowledge that couldn't be filled by writing checks or giving orders. The sixth lesson arrived, with spring beginning to show itself in Central Park, and with it came the recognition that their agreed-upon arrangement was coming to an end. Sophia arrived that Sunday with ingredients for what she called graduation dinner, a complex menu that would incorporate techniques and principles from all their previous sessions. "Today we cook a real meal," she announced. "Appetizer, main course, dessert. You'll do most of the work. I'll guide and advise. This is your chance to show me what you've learned." Working through the elaborate menu, a seafood bisque, blackened salmon with vegetables, and bread pudding with whiskey sauce, Harrison realized how much his relationship with food and cooking had changed over the past 3 months. Tasks that had seemed impossibly complex during their first lesson now felt manageable, even enjoyable. He could taste and adjust seasonings with confidence, handle knives safely and efficiently, understand how different cooking methods affected texture and flavor. But more than technical skills, Harrison had developed something Sophia called kitchen consciousness, the ability to pay attention to multiple processes simultaneously, to anticipate problems before they occurred, to treat cooking as a form of mindfulness that required complete presence and engagement. As they sat down to eat the meal Harrison had largely prepared himself, Sophia offered an assessment that meant more to him than any business achievement he had ever earned. "This is restaurant quality," she said after tasting everything. "Not just the techniques, but the understanding behind them. You've learned to cook with intention, with awareness of what you're trying to achieve and how to get there. I'm genuinely impressed." Harrison felt a pride different from anything his wealth or business success had ever provided, the satisfaction of skill earned through effort, of knowledge gained through patient practice, of competence developed rather than purchased. "What happens now?" he asked as their meal concluded and their formal arrangement came to its agreed-upon end. Sophia considered the question carefully, and Harrison could see her weighing multiple factors: their improved relationship, his demonstrated commitment to learning, the complex history that would always exist between them. "Now you continue practicing," she said finally. "You use what you've learned. You keep developing your palate and technique. You remember that cooking is about more than just feeding yourself. And maybe, if you want to continue learning and I have time to teach, we can discuss more advanced lessons. But that would be a new agreement, based on who we are now rather than who we were before." As Sophia prepared to leave, she turned to Harrison with a final observation that carried the weight of reconciliation and the possibility of genuine friendship. "You know, Harrison, when I worked for you before, I thought you were incapable of seeing people like me as fully human. But these lessons have shown me that you can learn, you can change, you can develop the kind of attention and respect that makes real relationships possible. That gives me hope for you and for the possibility that other people in your position might also learn to see and value what they've been missing." After Sophia left, Harrison sat in his kitchen, now truly his kitchen in ways it had never been before, and reflected on the journey that had brought him from dismissive employer to grateful student. He had gained far more than cooking skills over the past 3 months. He had developed capacities for attention, patience, and respect that were already changing how he approached other areas of his life. But most importantly, he had formed a relationship with Sophia that was based on mutual respect rather than economic inequality, on shared learning rather than invisible service. It wasn't the same as the relationship they might have had if he had recognized her worth years earlier, but it was real, valuable, and built on a foundation of acknowledged humanity that offered hope for continued growth and connection. Harrison understood that his education was just beginning, that learning to see and value what had always been present but unacknowledged would be the work of years rather than months. But for the first time in his adult life, he felt committed to work that mattered for reasons beyond financial gain, engaged in a process of development that would make him more human rather than just more successful. As evening shadows lengthened across his penthouse kitchen, Harrison began planning the meal he would prepare the next day, using techniques Sophia had taught him and honoring the tradition of care and attention she had helped him understand. It would be a small act, cooking for himself with full awareness of the process and ingredients involved, but it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. The first step in a longer journey toward becoming someone worthy of the gifts he had been given and the patience that had been shown to him by a teacher who had every reason to refuse him, but had chosen instead to offer grace in the form of knowledge shared and humanity acknowledged. The seasons turned, and with them came a transformation in Harrison's life that extended far beyond his newfound culinary skills. The cooking lessons with Sophia had concluded months ago, but their impact continued to ripple through his days in ways both subtle and profound. He ate differently now, shopped differently, thought differently about the invisible labor that sustained daily life. More importantly, he began to see people differently: the doormen in his building, the servers in restaurants, the countless workers whose efforts made his comfortable lifestyle possible. Harrison's relationship with Sophia had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, not quite friendship, not employer-employee, but a form of mutual respect and continuing connection that defied easy categorization. They texted occasionally about cooking questions or restaurant recommendations, and Sophia had agreed to additional lessons every few weeks, helping Harrison advance to more complex techniques and deeper understanding of culinary arts. But the real change was internal, existential. Harrison discovered that learning to cook had taught him how to live with greater attention and intention, how to find satisfaction in process rather than just results, how to value skills and knowledge that couldn't be monetized or leveraged for competitive advantage. For the first time since his early adulthood, he felt engaged with life in ways that transcended financial achievement. It was during this period of quiet transformation that Harrison received news that would test everything he had learned about value, relationship, and responsibility. Sophia called him on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, her voice carrying an urgency he had never heard before. "Harrison, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me tomorrow? It's about Magnolia Kitchen, but it's complicated." They met the next day at a coffee shop near the restaurant, and Harrison could see immediately that Sophia was under tremendous stress. Her usual composure was strained, her expression carrying worry that made her look older than her years. "The restaurant is in trouble," she said without preamble. "The owner made some bad financial decisions, took out loans he couldn't service, got involved with investors who turned out to be predatory. Magnolia Kitchen is going to close unless we can find new backing immediately." Harrison felt the news like a physical blow. Magnolia Kitchen wasn't just Sophia's workplace. It was her creative home, the place where her skills were fully appreciated and her contributions properly valued. The thought of Sophia losing this platform, being forced back into the kind of invisible service positions where her talents were underutilized, was personally painful to him in ways that surprised him with their intensity. "How much money are we talking about?" Harrison asked, his financial instincts immediately calculating possibilities. "About $300,000 to clear the debts and provide working capital for the next year," Sophia replied. "It's not an enormous amount for restaurant finances, but it's more than any of us have access to." Harrison's mind raced through options. $300,000 was a significant sum, but nowhere near the levels of capital he regularly deployed in his investment activities. He could easily provide that amount without affecting his own financial security. But he also understood that simply writing a check could fundamentally alter his relationship with Sophia in ways that might destroy the mutual respect they had carefully built. "Sophia," he said carefully, "I could provide that capital, but I need you to understand that if I do, it has to be on terms that don't compromise your independence or make you feel obligated to me in ways that would damage our relationship." Sophia's expression moved through surprise, suspicion, cautious hope, and back to wariness. "What kind of terms are you thinking about?" she asked. "A business loan with fair market interest rates and a clear repayment schedule? Or perhaps an investment partnership where I become a silent partner with no active role in operations? Whatever arrangement preserves your creative control and doesn't make you feel like you're back to working for me rather than with me." They spent the rest of the afternoon working through possibilities, with Sophia insisting on consulting with the restaurant's other staff members before making any decisions. Harrison appreciated her caution and collaborative approach. It demonstrated the respect for others' autonomy and dignity that he was still learning to practice consistently. The agreement they eventually reached was elegant in its simplicity. Harrison would provide the needed capital as a business loan at fair market rates, with Magnolia Kitchen staff having the option to buy out his interest over 5 years if the restaurant proved successful. His involvement would be purely financial. No input on operations, no claim on creative decisions, no presence in the day-to-day life of the establishment. "Why are you doing this?" Sophia asked as they finalized the arrangement. "You could invest this money in stocks or real estate and probably get better returns." Harrison considered the question carefully, recognizing that his answer would reveal how much his understanding of value and investment had changed over the past year. "Because some investments aren't about financial returns," he said finally. "This is an investment in something I believe in. Your talent, your vision, the kind of business that makes the world better rather than just more profitable. And selfishly, it's an investment in preserving a place where I can eat food prepared by someone who understands that cooking is about more than just calories and convenience. 6 months later, Harrison sat in Magnolia Kitchen eating what Sophia called her spring celebration menu. Dishes that showcase the best of seasonal ingredients prepared with the technical skill and emotional intelligence he had come to associate with her cooking. The restaurant was thriving under the new financial arrangement, busy enough to require additional staff but still intimate enough to maintain the warmth and attention to detail that made it special. Sophia joined him for coffee after the dinner service, looking relaxed and satisfied in ways he remembered from their early cooking lessons. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the money, but for the way you did it. You could have demanded control or recognition or some kind of public credit. Instead, you made it possible for us to succeed on our own terms." "I learned from a good teacher," Harrison replied. "Someone who showed me that the most valuable contributions are often the ones that remain invisible, that real worth isn't always measured in recognition or return on investment." As they talked, Harrison reflected on the journey that had brought them from the bitter ending of their employer-employee relationship to this moment of mutual respect and genuine partnership. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy, and it certainly hadn't been predictable, but it had been real, profound, and ultimately more valuable than any financial gain he had ever achieved. "You know," Sophia said as their conversation wound down, "I've been thinking about expanding beyond just the restaurant. Maybe offering cooking classes for people who want to learn the way you learned, not just techniques, but understanding. Philosophy as much as practical skills." Harrison's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "I think there would be huge demand for that kind of teaching. You have a gift for helping people understand not just how to cook, but why it matters. Would you be interested in being my first official student in the new program?" Sophia asked with a smile. "I mean, beyond the informal lessons we've been doing. A real curriculum, structured learning, maybe even working toward some kind of certification." "I would be honored," Harrison replied, understanding that this invitation represented far more than additional cooking instruction. It was an offer of continued relationship, ongoing learning, and the chance to be part of something Sophia was building rather than something he was buying. As he walked home through the Manhattan evening, Harrison carried with him the satisfaction of a day well spent, a meal properly enjoyed, a relationship that had been transformed from exploitation to partnership through patience, learning, and the gradual development of wisdom he hadn't known he needed. The cooking lessons that had begun as an attempt at redemption had evolved into something far more valuable, an education in how to live with greater attention, deeper respect, and more generous understanding of the invisible gifts that sustain daily life. Harrison had learned to cook, yes, but more importantly, he had learned to see, to value, and to participate in the quiet forms of care that make life meaningful beyond the accumulation of wealth and power. It wasn't the ending he could have predicted when Sophia first left his employment, but it was perhaps the ending they both deserved, built on honest acknowledgement of past failures, sustained effort to develop better ways of being, and the gradual cultivation of respect and affection that couldn't be purchased, but could be earned through consistent demonstration of genuine change. The future stretched ahead with possibilities Harrison wouldn't have imagined a year earlier. More cooking classes, deeper exploration of culinary traditions, continued partnership with someone whose knowledge and wisdom he had finally learned to value properly. But most importantly, it offered the ongoing opportunity to practice the kinds of attention and care that Sophia had taught him, to continue becoming someone worthy of the gifts he had been given and the patience that had been shown to him by a teacher who had chosen grace over resentment, generosity over justice, hope over the safer refuge of permanent distance. In the end, it was perhaps the most valuable investment Harrison had ever made, not in financial terms, but in the development of capacities that made him more human, more connected, more capable of recognizing and honoring the daily miracles of skill, dedication, and love that sustain life in ways that wealth alone can never achieve. And you, dear listener, sitting wherever you are right now, maybe you're in your own kitchen, or thinking about someone whose work goes unnoticed, or remembering a time when you felt invisible despite all you gave to others. Sophia's story, Harrison's transformation, reminds us that it's never too late to truly see the people around us, never too late to acknowledge the gifts we've been receiving without recognizing their value. Have you ever worked for someone who never really saw you? Have you ever been the person who failed to appreciate someone until after they were gone? Tell me in the comments below. Your story matters, and sharing it might help someone else feel less alone in their own journey toward recognition or redemption. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe, because these tales of human connection and transformation need to reach every person who has ever felt unseen, every person who has learned to see others more clearly, every person who understands that the most valuable investments aren't measured in dollars, but in dignity, respect, and the patient cultivation of genuine human connection. For more stories that honor the quiet heroes in our lives, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey, and I'll see you in our next story, where we'll explore another chapter in the endless book of human hearts, learning to recognize each other's worth.